In this lesson, we're going to make 6 wax melts using BW921. It's a soy pillar wax. You can find it, you can read more in the description below. The first step is to gather our supplies. You'll need some clamshell melts, some fragrance oil, you're going to need some dye, it can be liquid or solid. You'll need a heat source. I'm going to use a pour pot over a hot plate. You can use a double boiler or a Presto pot. You'll also need a scale to measure things, and most importantly, a calculator. You probably have this on your phone, but however you want to do your math. The first thing we're going to do is kind of like candles. We're going to figure out how much wax do we need to fill one clamshell mold, and then we can scale up from there. So the steps are pretty simple. Just like with candles, we'll take an empty clamshell mold and we'll fill it with water and figure out how much water fills one empty clamshell mold. Once we know that, we can transform that into a wax weight and a fragrance oil weight. So I'm going to do everything in grams for the exercise, but you can use ounces if you want, just don't use fluid ounces. So this holds 82 grams of water. Does not mean it holds 82 grams of wax, it means it holds 82 grams of water. So we'll pull this off and we'll do our conversion next. We'll use a conversion of 0.86 today. So that means that we'll take our 82 grams of water, multiply by 0.86. It gives us about 71 grams per melt. Multiply that by 6, gives us 423 grams of wax blend. So that's wax and fragrance oil. We'll assume a fragrance load of 9%. So divided by 1.09 gives us 388 grams of wax. Now, if you want to see the in-depth calculations, you can look below in the link. I filled out one of the practice worksheets with the math that we're using, but that leaves 423 minus 388, 35 grams of fragrance oil, which will leave us with a 9% fragrance load over the 6 wax melts. Measure out 388 grams of our wax. Your number may be a little different, but I'm going to measure it directly into the pour pot that I'm going to melt it in, just for simplicity. Now, whatever heat source you're going to use to melt down your wax, we'll get our wax placed on that and starting to melt. And while it's melting, we'll go ahead and shift over to measuring out the rest of our supplies. So we have 35 grams of fragrance oil to measure out, and I'll use my chemistry kit beaker that I have. You can use a disposable cup. Really, this doesn't differ from candle making in any way. So pour until you get to 35, pour out if you go over 35. Like I said, your number may vary, so check your math if you need to. At this point, it's highly recommended that you not only monitor your wax, but you find some good tunes to put on, and it really does help the candle making process. If you have a good environment, good listening, the wax responds very well to a good rhythm. You can stir the wax throughout to make sure it melts down a little faster. Just make sure whatever method you're using, you don't overheat the wax. You don't want to shoot past 200 like we talked about. We're aiming for 185 to 190. So 186 is exactly where we need to be. So we'll take this off the heat. Once we're off the heat, it's time to add our fragrance oil at about 185 degrees, 186, not a big deal. So add the fragrance oil. At this point, we can also add our color. If you're using color blocks, do that. If you're using liquid dye, it's totally up to you how many drops you want to use. I'm using brown from Candle Science. It's liquid. I'm going to use about 5 drops. We'll see how it turns out. Just like with candles, it's important that we stir our fragrance oil in for 2 minutes. And I really stress that. I know a lot of people think it's overboard, but stir for 2 minutes to make sure that stuff disperses evenly. Once we have all of that together with our clamshells laid out, it's time to pour. Now this wax has a pour temp around 170 degrees. Obviously the pour temp is a big part of your results, so you might be adjusting your process, but the supplier recommends for BW921 that you pour at about 170 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's what I decided to do here. In fact, my temperature had dropped a little below 170 after I was done stirring, so I put it back on the heat source just for a little bit. Now putting it back on the heat source is easier with a hot plate than it is necessarily with a Presto pot. Double boiler, you can get away with it as well, but whatever you have to do to hit your pour temp, don't be afraid to put that wax back on the heat. Now it's time to admire your fine handiwork. Hopefully you're proud of it. If not, just give it another go. But these will take about 45 minutes to 2 hours to kind of substantially harden. Obviously they may not be perfect, but they'll look a little bit like this. It always cools lighter than it looks. At this point, it's okay to close the clamshell melts and allow them to cure. Depending on your wax, your cure time may be a little bit different, and there are some different schools of thought regarding cure time for wax melts. The primary difference is candles are a solid and you burn them, and not all of the wax is melted. However, in a wax melt, all of the cube that you put into the melter is going to melt, which means it's going to completely undo any cure time that you put into the candle. Now, that being said, my recommended cure times are listed below, but your mileage may vary and you'll have to find what works best for your process.